Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Rachel Stepka, the Youth Power Learning Communications Manager. Welcome to the webinar, Can Life Skills Be Measured?, hosted by Youth Power Learning and the Cross-Sectoral Skills Community of Practice. For those of you who don't know Youth Power Learning, we are a USAID-funded project that focuses on generating and disseminating knowledge about the implementation and impact of positive youth development, or PYD, approaches in international development. So what is positive youth development? So PYD is both a philosophy and an approach to adolescent development. PYD programs recognize youth's inherent rights and result in youth who have assets, the ability to leverage those assets or agency, and the ability to contribute to positive change for themselves and their communities, surrounded by an enabling environment that supports them. So how can we partner together? Well, there are many ways to connect with other Youth Power activities. We have our learning hub, youthpower.org, where we share resources, events, information, and what works in positive youth development. We also have our PYD learning agenda, where we are gathering evidence and building the case for more evidence gathering in positive youth development. And if you have youth-related resources, those can be sent to info@youthpower.org. We also have our platform youthlead.org, where young changemakers can engage with their peers. And we also have our communities of practice, the Youth in Peace and Security, Gender and PYD, Youth Engagement, and Cross-Sectoral Skills for Youth, which is hosting this webinar. So next, I'll pass it on to Hillary Proctor. She is the co-champion of the Cross-Sectoral Skills Community of Practice and the moderator for this webinar. Over to you, Hillary.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Today, we are pleased to be learning from Room to Read's experience in developing and refining a comprehensive life skills assessment tool which measures knowledge, attitude, and skills across a range of competencies. We are joined by Room to Read's team members, Ryan Hebert, who's the Associate Director of Research, Monitoring, and Evaluation, and Linda Tran, who is the Associate Director of Girls Education Program. Together, they will discuss Room to Read's experience of developing their life skills assessment tool over multiple years and a geographic context. It is a pleasure to be learning from both of you, Ryan and Linda, today. Before we hear from our presenters, I would like all of our listeners to feel free to send questions for the presenters in the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we will put these questions forward to Ryan and Linda for a brief Q&A. With that, I would like to turn it over to Ryan and Linda to get us started.
Great. Hi, can you hear me? This is Linda. Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, great. Sorry. Thank you so much. Hi, good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon or good evening, I guess, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Linda, and I'd like to kick things off with a short introduction to Room to Read's Girls Education Program, just to give you some more context of what we do, what our program actually is, and in particular, how we approach life skills and what that intervention looks like. I think that having this background context will be a really nice complement to what my colleague Ryan will later be sharing and discussing for what is going to be the bulk of this webinar, and that's on what we're measuring in terms of life skills and how we're measuring it, including the challenges and the learnings that come with trying to build an assessment tool to be implemented across multiple countries. So before we dive into all of that, I'll start with a brief snapshot of Room to Read and what our organization does. Room to Read was founded in 2000, and we aim to transform the lives of children around the world by advancing both literacy and gender equality through education. So we have two key programmatic focuses. Our literacy work targets children at the primary school level, while our girls' education program targets adolescent girls at the secondary school level. Our girls' education program, or GEP for short, focuses on girls' transitions to and through secondary school, because that's where we've seen and where we know some of the biggest and most permanent gaps in gender equality in education take place. As many of you are well aware, girls in many countries face gender-specific challenges to completing education, and these challenges, such as lack of resources, lack of strong role models, or limited family and community support. These challenges and many more are in many ways heightened and become even more urgent and pronounced as girls get older and reach that critical adolescent secondary school level. So our girls' education program is designed to try to address these gender-specific challenges, to support girls to stay in school longer, and to develop the skills and agency to make smart decisions about their lives and their futures. So on the left-hand side of the slide here, you'll see the different inputs, or really our girls' education program intervention. These 4 things, life skills, mentoring, family, school, and community engagement, and material support, these are the things that we believe, based on over a decade of our experience on the ground, best practice, and research, these are the things that we think makes a difference in achieving the outcomes that we want to see. And that is girls who say things like, I have a voice and deserve to be heard, or I'm healthy and have control over my body. So I'm going to go a bit more into each of these different program components in the next few slides. But first, here's a quick look of where we work. So this map shows the different countries where we're implementing our girls' education program, and along with the dates or the years of when we first launched in each country. We're currently in 8 different countries with a heavy concentration in Asia. I'm sorry that the dates didn't seem to appear on the slide. Oh, and there we go. A little bit delayed. So taking you back to our program components, I want to briefly walk you through what each of these are a little bit, so you know what we mean when I say we do life skills and mentoring and how they all relate and interact with one another. So, oops, sorry, there's so much delayed animations here. So on this slide, this is an overview of the core activities within each of the components of our girls' education program. Within our life skills component, our key activity is the delivery of curriculum sessions. So we have a fairly comprehensive life skills curriculum that spans 7 years, starting from grade 6 all the way up to grade 12. And our curriculum and framework is developed specifically around 10 key life skills that we have prioritized for adolescent girls. And these curriculum sessions not only build upon those 10 life skills, but they also build in complexity as girls progress within a grade and across grade levels as she advances through secondary school. Our life skill sessions are scripted session plans that are roughly 60 minutes long, and at the lower secondary level, about 15 to 16 sessions conducted in each grade. Our 2 core activities within mentoring are group mentoring and individual mentoring. Group mentoring involves smaller groups of girls, maybe 10 to 15 in total, that have facilitated peer discussions on set topics that actually complement and build off of the life skill sessions themselves. And individual mentoring is provided on an as-needed basis to those girls who present some risk of dropping out of school. And that individual mentoring could take the form of something like just a conversation with a girl after school or a home visit. Within our family, school, and community engagement component, we prioritize parent engagement in the form of educational workshops. And that happens twice a year for every year that their daughter is on our program. So as you can imagine, that's a span of 6 to 7 years that our parents are receiving these workshops, which can range from between 12 to 14 in total. And these workshop topics include things like the values of girls' education, how to support academic learning at home, and an introduction to life skills, like what they are and why they're important. Because I really want parents to understand what we're trying to teach girls and to really understand what we're trying to achieve through our program. And we also conduct one larger awareness-raising event with the broader community around topics related to girls' rights, gender equality, or to advocate on specific challenges a girl may face in that particular community, such as migration, early pregnancy, or early marriage. And then finally, a smaller portion of our intervention is providing targeted financial assistance to those girls where the economic barriers of going to school is too great. So that includes support for standard things like tuition, uniforms, textbooks, and the like. So all of these activities are conducted primarily by paid staff, sometimes teachers, but mostly staff who we call social mobilizers, women from the local community who serve as strong role models and mentors for girls on the program. And these social mobilizers, these women, they're really the ones on the front lines, on the ground, at our schools, at the homes, with girls and parents, and just really serving as that consistent advocate in a girl's life. And so often I like to call them the secret sauce of our program. So everything you see in this slide is really our girls' education program. This is our model. And all the activities shown here are implemented in all of our program countries. Of course, there's some contextualization and adaptation, but at the core, our girls' education program, say in Bangladesh, looks the same as it would in Tanzania. That said, though, our life skills work is really the heart or the flagship of our program, as it ties directly back to our program goals of girls developing the skills and agency to advocate for herself and the choices she makes in her life. So we have intentionally and earnestly tried to design these other program components to support and really lift up that life skills piece. For example, the group mentoring I mentioned earlier, those sessions are aligned with the topics and the content within our life skills curriculum. And a significant portion of our parent workshops are focused on orienting parents to life skills. We even do mock life skill sessions with parents so that we can encourage better understanding and hopefully have parents foster and support their daughters' life skills development in the home environment. So we've really tried to weave and link all the program components together around a standard life skills framework. So let's dive more into that life skills component. As I mentioned earlier, our life skills framework and curriculum are built around 10 key life skills. And so you may be asking, well, what are those life skills? So here on this slide, you can see these are the 10 skills that Room to Read has prioritized. And these skills have been slightly adapted, but essentially really the same ones that have been recommended by the World Health Organization as the essential and kind of relevant skills across cultures that adolescents need to succeed and thrive. And so we have grouped and organized these skills into 3 different areas covering self-awareness, self-efficacy, and social awareness. So this has formed the basis of our life skills curriculum and obviously the basis of our measurement tools. So before I hand it over to Ryan, I just wanted to end with this screenshot, which is just you can get a better sense, a glimpse into a sample life skill sessions that we have. And again, these are scripted sessions that build upon another in scope and sequence across 7 years of secondary school. So I'm going to stop there, and I know I presented a lot of information in a short amount of time. So if you do have questions, please do submit them for the brief Q&A at the end, and we'll try to get to them. But I hope I've given you some more familiarity with our program and a brief overview of our life skills work. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to take us through the nitty-gritty of trying to measure these life skills and what our efforts have been across 7 program countries so far.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, this is Ryan Hebert, and I sit on the Research Monitoring and Evaluation team at Room to Read. So as Linda was describing, our girls' education has, in a way, 2 main areas of goals. On the one hand, we want to help girls to stay in school and graduation throughout secondary school. And the outcomes there are relatively straightforward to measure, and we do a lot of measurement there. The other area of goals, and arguably in some ways the more important area of goal for the program, is to equip these girls with the skills that they're going to need to thrive throughout their futures. And that is just an inherently more complex outcome. It's really difficult to measure. One of the things that we believe at Room to Read is that for those kinds of complex measures, it's best to picture. And so among the different ways that we look at measurement in life skills are a life skills assessment and then an annual alumni survey that we do with program graduates. The first really gives us a sense of those internal changes of the girls as they progress through the program, changes in their skills, their attitudes, perspective, relatively short-term changes. The second, the alumni survey, on the other hand, gives us a sense of how these changes that are internal translate into the external world in terms of long-term behavior, interactions with the world, the longer-term outcomes that we ultimately want to see, which is improvements in our program graduates' lives over the longer term. I'll spend the bulk of the presentation on the life skills assessment because that's where a lot of the focus of our work has been, but we will talk about both of those throughout this. So the life skills assessment, we started a couple of years ago developing this measure. And as you can see, we had kind of an ambitious wish list of design parameters that really...
Ryan, yeah? We have a really difficult time hearing you, and some of the members have also posted. I don't know if you can go closer to the microphone or speak a little louder. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay, I can try to speak up, and hopefully the connection will improve. I'm not sure if there's maybe a problem with my internet connection, but yeah, I'll try to speak up as best I can and keep the microphone close. Okay, so anyway, these parameters sort of represent the ideal version of this tool, things that we would really like to see to have the kind of the perfect version of this measurement tool. As we'll describe, I think over the last couple of years, we've made a lot of progress toward this, but development continues, and there remain some areas where we're continuing to develop and improve the tool. Briefly, I'll talk about the different scales that we did reference in the literature. Obviously, we wanted to know what else was being done in this field. And I think as you all know, there is a lot of work done both in the academic world as well as in the practitioner world on different ways to measure different aspects of this. And so we started with our framework of 10 skills that Linda presented, and then tried to go out there and see what were some of the best tools that we found in that literature that targeted as close as possible to that skill. You'll see in some cases it really was one-to-one. We have a communication skill. Aaron Castle have a communication measurement scale, and so does positive youth development. In other cases, looking at something like self-confidence or expressing and managing emotions, there wasn't necessarily a one-to-one, but we found some that captured a lot of the related concepts. I think one challenge here is just with the terminology, and I think as probably most people on this call will be keenly aware, there is a lot of difference between the ways that different actors in the space use these different terms. The same term may be referring to different concepts, or different terms may be referring to the same concept. I think this is an area where projects like the Harvard taxonomy project that's going on, or others that are working on kind of reconciling and standardizing this language can really make a real contribution to the space, so that we can all hopefully start to more and more speak the same language. So starting with these different tools that we found in the literature, we also supplemented those pre-existing scales with several things that we developed in-house at Room to Read. So in some cases, additional explanation. We did have some newly developed scales, some newly developed exercises that made up part of the overall tool. Added some items to tools, and I'll discuss kind of what that looks like in a couple of slides. We also wanted to add some basic demographic questions to understand a little bit more about the population that we're serving and how that might relate to the development of life skills, as well as some questions about gender knowledge and gender-related attitudes. Just to give you an overview of what our process looks like each time that we do this, it tends to be about a 9-week process. This is what we arrived at after some trial and error. It is a time-consuming process. It's heavy on pre-testing. It's heavy on sort of discussion and testing and retesting things in the field. And although it's time-consuming, we really feel that it is important. This kind of contextualization that we find that you need to do from one context to another, from one language to another, really takes some time to get right. And although in the end, I would say the differences between the versions of this tool that we've used in different contexts ends up not being so great, knowing exactly which changes you need to make is a tricky process and takes time, even if those changes ultimately are relatively small. This gives you an example of some of the changes that arise out of this process, either through discussions with our country teams or through the field testing. In some cases, we found overly complex phrasing or English-specific idioms. Some cases we really needed to be more explicit around what we meant than the way that we found things given in the original tool that we were referencing. In some cases as well, as I said, there was not necessarily a one-to-one match between the way that Room to Read thinks of a particular skill area and what the tool that we referenced was really trying to measure. And so, for example, our conceptualization of decision-making for these adolescent girls includes a lot of content around peer pressure. And so we wanted to add some more questions on peer pressure to our measurement tool, even though the original decision-making scales that we referenced did not really have that as the same kind of focus. So as we're making these changes, how do we know if we've been successful in kind of making the changes that we need to make? And one way that we look at this question is through reliability, which some of you may be very familiar, some of you may not be. That basically means that your measure sort of hangs together in a consistent way, that two questions that are both trying to measure the same underlying skill, girls' responses to them should be somewhat similar. They should follow similar patterns. Getting high reliability, in addition to knowing that your questions are sort of targeted right, also lets you know that they are being understood in the way that you mean them to be. And that's something that that has been a real challenge as we work across cultures, across languages, is making sure that what our respondents hear and understand in a question is exactly what we meant for them to hear and understand when we were designing the tool. So we measure reliability in a couple of ways, but probably the primary one is through a measure called Cronbach's alpha. And again, some of you may be familiar and may be digging into this table in detail right now. Some of you may be relatively new to this as a measure and may be looking at this feeling very overwhelmed. I think the interpretation of this statistic can be complex, but as a rule of thumb, what we really want to see to give us a sense that these scales are working kind of as designed is to see this reliability figure, this Cronbach's alpha score, in the range of about 0.7 and higher. So if you look at the bottom row of this, the overall average for each of the skills, and then these different administrations are listed chronologically from left to right. So we started with our India pilot, then our Tanzania pilot, and so on. And if given that target of around 0.7 and above, you can see that in general, we've been at or pretty close to that on average for all of our administrations except for that first one. The first time that we did this in India, that first pilot, we were really well below the range of reliability that we needed to complete the analyses that we wanted to complete. And so that's really when we went back and strengthened that 9-week process that I showed you 2 slides ago to focus more on getting the translation and back translation right, to add additional days of pre-testing so that we could really test and retest thoroughly each and every question on this to make sure that we were getting the comprehension and that our questions were on target. I'm seeing one person in the chat saying the audio cut out. I'm hoping that it hasn't cut out for everyone. Okay, great. Looks like the audio is now okay. So another way of looking at this same data is just in a simple graph. On the left-hand side, you can see that average, again, graphed out chronologically here from top to bottom. And again, you can kind of see all are basically in that range of 0.6 to 0.7, with the exception of that first pilot in India. So it really shows you the value of that initial time and resource investment in getting the pre-testing right and getting the tool right. On the right, you can see there is also some variation across the different skill areas, where some we seem to be able to measure so far a little bit more reliably than others. Right now, relationship building measures are coming across pretty reliable. On the other hand, if you go down to decision making, there's maybe a little bit more room for continued development there. And so, as I said, all of these tools remain under development. We're still finding areas that we can focus on and strengthen over time through additional data and additional work. Overall, on reliability, basically, I think the summary is to say this is by no means a solved problem. We're not done working on this. We're not completely happy where things are. But we feel like we've made a lot of progress since that initial pilot, and we've kind of shown what you have to do to improve it. We've gotten things to sort of a reasonable enough place that we feel like things are moving forward pretty well. At this point, we have fielded actually, I think, 6 different baselines, but 4 of them we've so far completed the data analysis for. And so I'm presenting results for India, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Tanzania. If you look at these mean scores, there's a couple of things that I'd like to draw your attention to. For most of these different skill areas, the possible range of scores is from 1 to 4. Most of these are all pretty standard Likert-based scales. The only exception is creative problem solving, which is actually task-based, and so the scoring works a little bit different there. But most of these you can think of as ranging from 1 to 4. So two comments on this. One, if you look at these mean scores, on average, on the range of 1 to 4, these scores, even at baseline, tend to be a little bit toward the higher end of that scale. And so this is something that could create some challenges for us at Nline, because there's not really a lot of headroom necessarily for girls' scores to improve over time. So this may be an indication that we need to find ways to make this measurement a little bit more challenging. We'll just have to see sort of how things go at Nline, whether there are detectable changes, but we are looking for ways that we can also make this to be a little bit more challenging and try to level set this tool at the right level so that we can capture kind of the full range a little more strongly. The other thing that I'll draw your attention to is that we do see some variation across countries, with India and Tanzania in these initial baselines tending to score on average a little bit higher, Cambodia and Bangladesh scoring a little bit lower. And I would say at this point we're interested in this result, and we don't yet know quite how to interpret it. I think that will be more clear in the context of data that we'll receive from additional countries, as well as the end-line data. It could be that the we're dealing with in Cambodia and Bangladesh are maybe facing some additional challenges, and maybe their baseline levels of these skills is actually lower. It could also be that the respondents in those contexts are maybe being a little bit more honest about some of their weaker areas than the respondents in India and Tanzania, which may indicate that in Cambodia and Bangladesh we've done a little bit of a better job in reducing the potential bias of the self-report nature of the tool. So this is something that we will want to continue to examine over time, but these results are kind of intriguing to start with. As I also mentioned, we do collect some basic demographic data with all of these baselines, and what that allows us to do is to look at ways that these dynamics may play out in different groups. I'm presenting just one example here, which is in the India baseline. We found that the scores do vary a little bit with wealth, and that across all of these different areas, consistently, the bottom wealth quintile did score slightly lower than the top wealth quintile, but these differences are very, very small. I think none of them are statistically significant. And so that in itself is kind of an interesting finding that, again, will become more interesting and will give us more of a clearer idea of how to interpret it in light of the end-line findings once we have those. Do we see at the end line that there are bigger differences, that there are no differences? These are the kinds of questions that we will be interrogating in the data, because we do really want to understand how our program may be differentially serving different groups, whether it's those that are relatively richer and poorer, whether it may be different ethnic groups or different caste groups, whether it may be those who have whose parents are literate versus not literate. We'll begin to get a picture potentially of how each of those different groups may be experiencing the program differently. Areas of ongoing development, I already mentioned a few, but some of the ones that we're particularly focused on. One challenge right now is the length of the administration of this. We basically have taken all of these individual tools and added them together, and effectively that means adding up the administration time of all these different instruments. We have been almost everywhere. We've been doing this survey administration through one-on-one interview between one enumerator and one girl who's responding. And that can take, average now, about 40 minutes per girl, which again is quite time-consuming, quite resource-intensive to do for large populations. One thing that we have tested as an approach to address this is in our recent work in Vietnam, we've actually done the administration through having the girls fill out a written form with half of our sample, so that we can compare across those who had the one-on-one interview versus those who took the written administration. And early results from that are pretty promising. It certainly requires a lot less time, both on an individual level, but also because you can have several girls working at the same time with a single enumerator. There is some indication also that it may reduce bias, because if you're being asked to sort of admit to some areas where you may be weaker, it may be a little emotionally easier for respondents to do that on paper, where they're not writing their name. It's sort of an anonymous submission, versus looking a stranger in the eye and telling them some areas where you may have weaker skill development. There's a lot of good literature about the effects of oral versus written interviews and how in many cases these kinds of written administrations can help to reduce that kind of desirability bias. Of course, the potential weakness of a written administration is that it really does depend a lot on the literacy level of the context. And so that depends on age group, it depends also on geography. With the groups that we were working with in Vietnam, literacy is quite high and has seemed to work quite well. So we will continue to test this in other locations to see if that result holds. And I think we're thinking this has a lot of potential. Reducing bias in general is something that is a challenge for any self-reported measure. We are continuing to test various different measures that are more task-based. We've tested a number of those already, some of which have not worked very well. Some have worked a little better and continue to be included in the current version of the tool. There are some basically simple listing exercises are there. Also in Vietnam, we've tested a role play exercise. The challenge here is that these kinds of more task-based measures can reduce bias, but they also tend to be more time-consuming and more challenging. They may require a higher level skill on the enumerator. They may be a little bit less objective to score. They sort of require more judgment than a simple Likert-based scale. And so finding the right balance where we think that we're getting something that's a little bit more objective than pure self-report while also being streamlined enough to include in a tool like this has been something that we're continuing to try to develop. And then a big area as well is demonstrating validity, which validity here is used basically to ask, are we measuring what we think that we're measuring? We do check for sort of expected relationships between the scales. And so, for example, conceptually, you may think that something would be very strongly related to a skill like self-control. And in fact, that is what we find in our measures, that those scales tend to correlate very highly together. But you can also look at things like academic scores. They're sort of grades in school, which you would think would also maybe be related to perseverance. And the picture generally for these kinds of correlations that we've checked, I would say, is mixed. In some cases, we do find the expected relationships. In some cases, we don't. How we interpret that, again, is kind of complex, and it's something that we're continuing to examine. But generally, we try to include some of these other measures in our assessments and in our analyses of the data to give us a sense of how well the tool is working. I'll move on to just briefly touch on the alumni survey. I know that we don't have a whole lot of time left, and I do want to save room for questions. But as I said, we want to get this picture of not only how girls report they're doing throughout the program, but also what their lives look like after the program, which we think really is the true measure of success of our program in a lot of ways. So we look at tertiary enrollment and completion. We look at employment. We look at decisions around marriage and family, and we look at community engagement. And we look at both objective and subjective measures, not only what girls are doing for their jobs, but also we ask them to sort of rate how satisfied they are with their current careers, or how satisfied they are with their community engagement activities, and how successful do they feel like they are in their lives at the current moment. Just to give a sense of what this looks like, it's a really quite simple survey, and we're continuing to refine the questions, but we really do want this to be quite straightforward of a conversation to have with our graduates. And so all of the questions we want to be as simple and as clear as possible. But you can see, for example, this is an example where question 5 here is in the more objective category. Although, of course, there could be a little bit of a gray area between having a job and not having a job at a particular time. Question 8 is really wholly subjective, where we ask them about their level of satisfaction. And we also try to get at the decision-making power that they feel that they've had, the extent to which they're making decisions themselves versus in consultation with others, versus really having decisions made for them in their lives, to get a sense of some measure of that kind of agency that they're experiencing. Briefly to the results, we do see that most of our program graduates do continue their education following the program. In fact, 5 years after graduation, most of the graduates are working in some form, as well as also continuing their education in some form. In terms of marital status, 1 year after graduation, about 20% of graduates are married, 81% are not. 5 years after graduation, 36% of graduates are married. This is at the age of roughly 23. These, I think, are interesting partly in the context of the geography where these women are living, where in these countries the median age of marriage ranges from 16 to 23. So 23 at the highest is the median age of marriage. So the fact that 5 years after graduation, at that age of 23, most of our program graduates are not yet married does at least suggest that the program may be encouraging some delay of marriage, which sort of makes sense with so many of these girls focusing on their careers and focusing on their studies. We also see that graduates who continue their educations do rate their overall success a little higher, as well as their overall satisfaction, their self-perceived success, as well as room to read's contribution to their lives. These are highly significant differences statistically. Ongoing development and limitations. We are, of course, continuing to strike a balance between contextualization and standardization. This is something that applies to really all of our measurement work, and I'm sure most people on the call will be familiar with that trade-off and that difficulty. This is an area where I think in a lot of ways we can benefit more with our alumni survey than we have in the past from work that has been done by others, and by looking at the sort of standard categories that have been arrived at by people who work across contexts, whether that's UNESCO and ILO, or others who are doing sort of similar kinds of work in terms of, categories of employment, categories of education, these things that so far we're using our own in-house categories that sort of may work better in some contexts than others. And I think moving towards more internationally recognized categories will help us a bit there. We're also working with our programs teams at the country and global levels just to continue to refine the alignment between the measurement and the desired program outcomes to make sure that we are really measuring what the program is designed to do for these graduates' lives over the long term. And I do just want to acknowledge there's a really quite significant limitation of this work where we are getting a good picture of the graduates of our program, but there's no direct way right now to conclusively attribute those results to our program. There is no control group in this for now. There's no counterfactual. And it's been a challenge to sort of get a good sense of what really would be a good basis of comparison, because these are girls that have worked through the 7 years of our program in many contexts and then have gone on into their wider lives. It's hard to now, in retrospect, identify a group of girls who 7+ years ago could have participated in the program but didn't, and kind of get a sense of how they're doing in their lives. So as for now, this remains without a control group. It really is a portrait of the GEP graduate, but can't really tell us that these that these effects that we're seeing really were generated by our program. So I will stop there. I've given a lot of information very quickly. I've seen a lot of questions coming in through the chat window, but maybe we can stop there and try to start to address those questions in at least
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Linda and Ryan both for your great contributions to this. We've organized out the many questions that have been coming in into several different categories. The 3 categories that we have is kind of the big picture questions, the process-oriented questions, and the measurement-based questions. And so we'll start up with that big picture, kind of what people are talking about there. And with that is looking to understand a little bit more if you guys have had a chance to understand specifically which skills or which method of skills delivery have had that largest impact on supporting girls to thrive.
I can speak to that a bit, and I think Linda might have more to say about that. I would say at this point, we can't really say yet which skills kind of translate really into that long-term success. Other than, to some extent we can get at this through qualitative research, and we've partnered with academics to take on some qualitative research around what our graduates feel has been particularly useful to them. I will say when we ask them about that, they are unlikely to say, they're unlikely to list one of the skills from the framework. They're more likely to refer to, particular sessions or particular activities that they still remember, or particular things that they learned around things like maybe financial management, or maybe, sexual health and reproductive health. I think over time, the kind of ultimate ideal version of this is to have this kind of skill measurement and the long-term life success measurement really talking to each other, so that we can see, oh, okay, we seem to be really doing a good job at influencing these different skill areas, and we see that when these skill areas are particularly strong, that those girls in particular seem to do really well in the future. But that's, a long time off in the future if we're able to get there at all. I think that would be kind of my dream version of this system, and sort of what we are striving toward, but we're definitely
I just wanted to
yet.
agree with you that we don't
Linda,
yet have a really good idea of which of these life skills in particular is maybe more effective than others. We're hoping that the data tells us that. But when you do talk to girls and talk to their parents and teachers, the ones that keep kind of coming out, a lot of girls talk about really appreciating being able to kind of express and manage their emotions and that self-control aspect, and being able to better communicate with their peers and adults. That has been kind of the highlight for a lot of the girls on our program, is just being able to kind of negotiate and have conversations with teachers and adults, and maybe in a way that they weren't as effective as before. And then also decision making is also a really popular one, that if you were to talk to a girl, these are the kinds of things that they kind of really resonate or stick out for them when we ask them, what's your favorite session, or what types of skills are you learning? Those are really the ones that I think that I've heard the most common across our country so far. But as Ryan said, we still don't know, and we're hoping to have a better sense through the measurement and the data.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing your insight on those. We have a couple of questions that are more oriented towards the process, and I'm going to lump several of these questions together to make it a bit easier for the two of you. But if you can talk a little bit about that contextualization process that you went through. You know, people are asking about what about Latin America or South America or India? How was that done? And with that, you know, in the feedback that you got from the multiple years of development, how did you refine those tools and really use that decision-making process? And with that, you know, did you end up bringing in technology or any other tools to help complement this?
Sure. So that contextualization process of the measurement doesn't involve a lot of technology. It's so far been a pretty manual process. Basically, the first thing that we do is we sit down with our country teams, Room to Read. In every country where we work, we have a staff of folks who are almost all, you know, from that context. From that country, speak the language natively, know the culture. And so the first thing that we do is we sit down with our country colleagues and go through the full tool item by item just to see what do we need to flag, what may be sort of, you know, not in alignment with the country context, maybe age inappropriate in the context, flagging any terms that are be difficult to translate into the local language, et cetera, et cetera. We then have, as I mentioned, a translation and back translation step, and we review that back translation against the original, again, really item by item, discussing with the country team to really make sure that we are confident that this translation is capturing exactly the sense of the original question in English that we developed. Following that, it's mostly field testing. And so the field testing process is basically we're doing what's called cognitive labs. So we sit down with a group of girls that match as closely as possible to the ultimate population we want to work with. And one by one ask them the questions in the survey, and not just the questions in the survey, but afterwards we have them answer the initial question, but ask them a lot of probes on each question. So, you know, ask them, oh, you know, was there anything in particular that you were thinking about when you gave that answer? Is there an example from your own life or something that you've heard that this makes you think of? Can you rephrase this question in your own words or think of a different way to say that? And then we sit down again with the country teams and go through those girls' answers to the probes, and you know, discuss and reach consensus on whether we think that she did or didn't understand the question the way that we intended it to be understood. In many cases, we'll see that the question is being understood in a subtly different way, which may mean that we need to change the terminology, or we need to find phrasing that's more explicit, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of what the contextualization process ends up looking like. I think, you know, we've used it across now 7 different countries, South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Africa. So, you know, I have no reason to think that the same process wouldn't work in other contexts, whether that's Latin America or the Middle East or wherever else. But we haven't.
Great, thanks. There are several questions that are coming in around the actual measurement and the approaches and tools that you've used. So I don't know if we're going to have a chance to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to pull out 2 of them and ask you guys. The first one is, with the high baseline scores in mind, do you have any ideas for testing or administrating strategies that might be able to help the tool pick up those changes over time? And an additional question out to you guys around the measurement context is, have you ever tried a hybrid approach where the questions are posed orally to the group of participants, but then they write down their responses individually on paper? So I'll throw those two out to you guys.
Sure, I can speak to both of those. So right now, in terms of the high baseline scores, I think for the fielded, that's definitely a challenge at Nline. I think for one thing, we'll have to see what the Nline scores look like. If there's enough, there is some room for enough upward shift, and if there does seem to be enough of an upward shift that we can, reliably detect that, then that's great. I think a big question for us is going to be, what if we don't? And there, I think that more is going to influence how we take on future baselines and whether we need to try to, for example, look at more task-based measures, look at more measures that maybe were designed for older groups, whether that's older adolescents or adults, and maybe that's something where we can see more upward movement as girls mature. I think in the meantime, when we start fielding those Nlines, we will want to include some additional measures in that to try to flesh out the picture, which while those won't give us a sense of change necessarily, they'll help us to flesh out that picture more fully. The other thing that we can do, and this sort of breaks into less objective, but still I think can yield at Nline about what they see as the changes in themselves, and sort of asking, as compared to when you started the program, do you consider yourself more or less likely to X? And that can, in some ways, give you a sense. Again, it's vulnerable to bias, maybe even more so than our sort of regular self-report questions, but it is something that I think can be used productively, that we have used in some of our other kinds of assessments like this. That self-reported change.
Great, thanks for your response to those, Ryan. As we're running up with time, there's one last question that is out there, as many people are really curious to learn more, as they are also going through their own assessment methodology and M&E toolkit development. So many people are asking, how do they get in touch with you? How do they get access to the tool? What is the best way for them to continue their learning from Room to Read?
Yeah, so definitely you can email me, you can email Linda. Our email addresses are right now on your screen. In terms of sharing the tool, the short answer is we are really committed to finding a way to share this tool, and we're not ready to do that just yet. And the reason for that at the moment, one of the reasons, but I think one, is for us, one of our lessons is that it's really not just about the tool. It's equally, if not more, about the process of adaptation. And so one of the things that we are prioritizing for this year is to document some of our lessons learned to date, to really build out not just a tool, but a toolkit that will provide the measurement tools themselves, but that will also really detail out what we've found works best in terms of the adaptation process, in terms of the administration process, some of the things that some of the pitfalls that we have stumbled into that we want to caution people to avoid, just because we feel ultimately the tool without that additional context is not going to be all that helpful, and folks are going to end up sort of having to reinvent the wheel and having to make a lot of the same mistakes that we have made. And so we are at work now on starting to develop that tool in context. Once that is a little further along, then Room to Read as an organization will be looking at sort of exactly in what way and under what conditions we want to share that. Those decisions are being made by people smarter than me, but we are definitely actively in discussion around that. And unfortunately, at the moment, I just have to say stay tuned on that. We are committed to sharing at some point in the future, but are not able to share the final tools today. Having said that, do reach out. I'm happy to discuss any questions about the methodology. We can certainly talk about what has worked for us, what hasn't worked well for us, more for those who are struggling. As I know, Room to Read is not by far the only organization that's trying to figure this out.
Great, thanks Ryan, and thanks to Linda, you as well. We really appreciate both of you taking time out of your day to share with a larger community about the experiences you've had of using life skills and impacting girls and young women. It's been very helpful to learn, and we do look forward to hearing more about your lessons learned in the future. With that, I would like to turn it back on over to Youth Power Learning for the last word and to help us close up.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you, Linda and Ryan, for the presentation. So what can you do next? You can contribute to the message of positive youth development. We are on social media on Twitter and Facebook at YP Learning. You can also join the conversation by joining a community of practice. As I mentioned before, we have 4 of them, and they are listed on our website, youthpower.org, and check out our resources, best practices, and knowledge shared. And we also want to hear from you and what works and what doesn't work in your youth programming. And if you have any materials you'd like to share, please send us an email at the email address on the screen. And then, as usual, the recording and slides of today's webinar will be shared with all registrants, and it will also be posted on youthpower.org in the coming week. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and have a great day, great evening.